Well, thank you, Bob and Don and Kevin. Far surpassed my expectations. The issues here are evident. Definitely, there are aspects of suburbia that were planned. There are reasons for that we can, that we've just been, we've touched on a few of them. The myths that are created and why those myths were created and what impact those myths have had. We've got to be aware of those as we move forward. We have a couple of minutes for some questions. Would our guest like to come up? And we have 3 microphones here, and we'll try to get a bit of conversation in here. I would like to just start out the questions, and we'll open it up to the audience. Bob, you mentioned at the end of your talk 3 ideas, 3 approaches to historic preservation. And I would like to get from each of you your best idea of what would work. And with this in mind, what kind of city do we want the Valley to be, suburbia to be in 20, 30, 40, 50 years? And how would an approach to preservation create that?
Difficult. It's difficult for me to comprehend the implications of your question as it might apply to Lakewood, where you have, as I say, 17,500 houses that are built all at once, and therefore all of them are available for designation under the various guidelines that we've seen, the federal guidelines. Of course, there are different guidelines in the city of Los Angeles. Lakewood does not have a historic overlay scheme, does not have a zoning system that takes account of the historic qualities of Lakewood, because no one in Lakewood thinks those qualities are historic. They're just what everyone lives with. And so, and I'm sure that homeowners in Lakewood would be a little nervous if the city decided to turn every street in Lakewood into a historic overlay zone designation, and with the various restrictions that might bring on what they can do to their home. So I do know what Lakewood will be like 30 years from now, though. I can answer that question. It'll be pretty much the same as it is today. No, there are no bulldozers idling at the end of my block waiting to bulldoze down the 60-year-old houses of Lakewood. It'll become more dense in some ways because the way in which Lakewood was developed around its regional shopping center, and with neighborhood shopping at the major intersections scattered throughout the city, there's plenty of room for the removal of outmoded retail stores and their replacement with things that might be more like mixed use. That certainly will happen in Lakewood. But the 30 years from now, driving down a Lakewood street will probably be like driving down a Lakewood street today.
Well, it's funny, look out 30 years in the San Fernando Valley. Well, that's a little bit scary, because at that point we're talking about these suburbs will start to be 100 years old. And I don't think the houses were planned to last 100 years. And so when you get, I don't know, the homes of a couple of 100,000 people getting old all at the same time, I think that's going to put challenges on society and the city that might be a little bit surpass the challenges of trying to figure out what to preserve. But the valley has already changed. Most of the, I think this is true, that a majority of the population already live in multi-family housing, apartments or condos, and that was not the way it started out to be. And the kind of the nature of the community has changed a lot in ways that I don't think we fully appreciated what that means. San Fernando Valley started out as this very homogeneous, or the suburbs of the valley started out as this very homogeneous white suburban enclave, and now it's as diverse as any other large place in the country. If you just took it by itself, and certainly as diverse as Los Angeles if you separated the two things. And I'm not quite sure how that plays out, what that means for how people want to live going forward. You know, Panorama City has already made that transformation from being, you know, an upper end white suburb to a place of great diversity. And you know, you see the nature of the shops have changed, what's being offered, the way people want to shop is different. One of the most successful department stores in Panorama City now is the Curacao, which delivers, you know, people come in and buy appliances and have them delivered in Nicaragua and in Mexico from Curacao. And so these are all things that I think will be realities that have to be confronted if you're looking at the future of the San Fernando Valley.
Well, I'm more in the business of what happened than what should happen, so I don't have any particular fixed opinions on this, but it does strike me that when you look at what's in the Van Nuys overlay zone, for example, and think that somehow there's some great virtue in original windows, I don't know if I understand that, particularly since I think what that does is it says, here are the things that are designated, these are good, and by that definition, everything else is somehow somewhat inferior. What the original architect intended, in many cases there weren't even architects here, what the original designer intended was better than what my father decided to do 20 years ago. And you know, Don, I'm not sure that you're right about that, Lakewood in 30 years. Lakewood hasn't changed very much, but look at Levittown, where you can barely find a house. In fact, that's true of so much of the valley. And you know, if Lakewood is successful, it's close in, it has increasingly the transportation to a lot of jobs. I wouldn't be surprised if there wasn't a massive tear-down movement at some point in the future. But is that bad? Is that something that we should be discouraging? And I don't know that that is.
Well, I don't know about discouraging. I doubt if there's political will in Lakewood to discourage it too much, although Lakewood does have an anti-mansionizing ordinance that went into effect about 8 years ago. And of course, Lakewood doesn't look like those undecorated sheds that I showed in the slide program. It looks like the houses I showed at the very end, where people have invested a lot in those homes and made them their own. When I argue that Lakewood won't change much, I also mean that the built form of Lakewood won't change much. The gridded qualities of Lakewood are not going to change. Some aspects of land use decision making going back to 1950 are going to persist no matter what. We don't typically see suburban neighborhoods being replaced, the street grid in suburban neighborhoods being replaced by something else. It just hasn't happened. I don't know, maybe 100 years from now that might be the case, but I don't see it happening in 30 years, certainly.
I'd say that we do need to look at this issue in kind of with a fine grain as well. There's so many different issues to the impact of preservation on the quality of life in the city. I myself feel that, for example, the pictures I think, Bobby, you showed of a neighborhood which is fairly intact, but it has a continuity, a character, an identity, a scale, which I would argue does affect the quality of life there. People want to move to that neighborhood, live in that neighborhood because it has a certain character, architectural character, quality, consistency, and so forth. I think that's one important element in creating a good city, is identifying, and hopefully Survey LA does this, identifying neighborhoods that are strong, and not only residential neighborhoods, but commercial neighborhoods as well, and doing what we can to maintain the strength, not undermining the strengths that are already there. But then there are many other considerations as well. I don't think you can do that to the whole valley and maintain it the way it is. Okay, let's take some questions from the audience. Back here first.
One of the social changes that seems to be occurring now is there seems to be a change in the philosophy of home ownership. And that is, there are a lot of people after this recession, depression, whatever you want to call it, who are no longer interested in purchasing a home, but rather are renting. And I would like to know if that kind of social change persists, and it's impossible to determine whether that's the case, what would be the impact
It's an interesting problem and certainly a real one. Many of the homes being purchased today in what's regarded as a sort of a new bubble of home sales, many of those homes are being purchased by speculators who intend to rent them out. And that does present an interesting problem for, as you say, the social capital that might be found in a community. It takes an awful lot of involvement of people, time-challenged these days, time-challenged people, to keep a place like Lakewood going. It's at 600 volunteer coaches every year coaching at park leagues and all the other community organizations that depend upon volunteer labor. And the question that's often raised is, well, who will invest that kind of energy in a neighborhood if they're not owners? I don't know. That is a troubling question. And it does have some implications for how the social fabric as well as the material fabric of a neighborhood would be sustained.
If you look around the world at the places that have much lower home ownership rates than the U.S., you'll find some surprising examples like Switzerland and Germany, where they're, for tax reasons and other reasons, they have much lower home ownership. I wouldn't say that they suffer necessarily. So we've had it in our mind that home ownership is necessarily good. We have spent an enormous amount of taxpayer money on that, and maybe it is, but I'm not sure the evidence is in.
Let's see, back here? Yes.
Yeah, I was reading in this handout about Levittown, or mentioning Levittown, that the builder instructed a salesman not to sell to Jews or African Americans, and I'm wondering if that was the case in the San Fernando Valley.
Yes. It was written actually into the deed restrictions in vast parts of the San Fernando Valley, going back to the beginning of at least the beginning of the subdivisions that happened after the water got here. And in fact, if just about anybody who owns a home here, if they go back and look at their deed, they might find that language still in there. It doesn't have any effect. It's not legal. It hasn't been legal since 1948, I think, is when it was struck down.
The ultimate decision on conditions, covenants, restrictions was 1953, but it was begun in 48 to restrict the ability to enforce those.
And it was laughable the way it was turned, because some of the clauses were really long. I mean, they listed all kinds of, subdivisions of society that they weren't allowed to live in these homes, weren't allowed to either occupy the homes or to buy them. And I think that's a widespread thing, not just in the Valley. This was true over much of Los Angeles, but the Valley developed, a little bit later in areas, so I think it was more pronounced here. Ironically, because there were parts of the Valley where there had always been Mexican laborers, places, in the Northeast Valley, Pacoima and San Fernando, back to the 1930s and 20s, there's great pictures of the schoolyards being very mixed racially and ethnically in that part of the valley at that time. And it's sort of like there was a backlash against that. And the kind of the racism of the valley sort of came in later.
It's interesting that the earliest court decisions, many of them weren't about ownership, that in many cases you could own houses, you just couldn't live there, which tells you something about the importance of private property at the same time as the keeping the homogeneity of the neighborhood.
That's one of the ironies when we talk about Lakewood, bought by Mark Taper, Ben Weingart, and Louis Boyer, all of whom were of Jewish backgrounds. And when they bought the unbuilt lots of the Montana Land Company in 1949, 1950, those lots all contained restrictions against sale of the property to Jews. And so the joke is they bought a suburb in which they couldn't live.
And that's also just quick mention, the Japanese internment in World War II actually had a pretty big impact in the San Fernando Valley, because Japanese farmers ran many of the fields, and besides losing a lot of their property, there was just a hard time getting the crops picked after the Japanese were interned. And so children, and I don't think that picture that I had is of these, but housewives were kind of begged by the authorities to go out in the fields and pick crops, to get the crops picked.
Okay, we got time for about a couple more questions. Ken?
I'm Ken Bernstein. I head the Office of Historical regarding how we think about integrity and alterations going forward. I guess I would ask the panel, though, what are the implications of that moving forward? I think I have a little bit of a hard time with trying to think of how we would encompass this, any single preservation tool that would allow us to think about the valley comprehensively. And preservation is ultimately also a bottom-up as opposed to a top-down type endeavor that requires a lot of buy-in from individual neighbors and homeowners. So how do we build on today? The second half of today, what we're doing with Landmark This is one way to encourage individuals to nominate places they care about as city historic cultural monuments. But how do we build on this to come up with ways of encouraging valley residents and homeowners to begin to think about their homes, their communities in historic preservation terms in a way that will redress some of these, in a way, inequities. So few historic cultural monuments and historic districts that are focused on this.
Well, let me suggest something that we haven't heard so far, and that is in considering how one might approach preservation within the context of a mass-produced landscape. Perhaps what preservation-minded neighbors should do is find the place of memory that is in their neighborhood. Maybe it's a school, maybe it's a church, maybe it's a synagogue, maybe it's a retail cluster or something along those lines, and try to understand how a place of memory might cohere the neighborhood around it so that you don't preserve just the architecture of a particular style of suburban home, but you preserve the character of a neighborhood which is focused on some place of memory. Those are hard to articulate, but in Lakewood, for example, we have 10 neighborhood parks. They're all fairly large, about 20 acres each. Some of them are somewhat larger. And everyone in Lakewood knows their neighborhood by the park. When you ask someone, where do you live, they'll say they live by Bolivar or Del Valle or San Martin or Mayfair. And so those places of memory seem to give coherence to the tracts of houses around, which are all the same anyway, but the consequence of the place of memory, there's something about it that can be articulated as distinctive. So that would be my only thought, is where are the places of memory in the valley, and what neighborhoods orbit around those places of memory?
I think your comments about preservation being both a top-down and a bottom-up movement are really interesting, because throughout the preservation movement, the preservationists went out and looked at all kinds of stuff that the elite world wasn't interested in. But one of the problems with the American political system is this horror of arbitrariness and something that's based just on opinion. And I think that a lot of our standards are things like, is it an original condition? Is it recognized as a master architect? These inherently are things that are a matter of opinion. And so what the architectural elite at one moment might like is something that maybe people in another strata of society, it isn't what they like. Now, the Valley Village photograph I showed is particularly useful for me because that particular part I know a little bit, and I know a lot of people there, and they are passionate about that. And in fact, there's been a lot of alteration, but a lot of that alteration is very sympathetic and, to my mind, extremely successful. Now, it's not going to meet any preservation criteria that we have on the books, but there must be a way that you can take into account popular taste as well as the taste of professionals or the people that are trying to police the intact part of it. So I think that idea of having the website and inviting comments is really on the frontier of this and what might happen in the future. So I applaud that.
I think your experience has been that there have been people coming to workshops and self-nominating parcels to be considered as part of Survey LA, if I understand correctly, which I think, there's, I would like to see there be more inclusivity in what's looked at, but I do think there has to be a line drawn, especially if things are going to be designated with some kind of protection by the city of things that are special and not just everything, like this idea of the whole valley being recognized in some way. I mean, no one who built it thought it was that special, and no one who ran it thought it was that special, and most of the people who lived here didn't think it was that special in any kind of total, because they've been tearing things down the whole time. There are 600 gas stations that used to be here that aren't here anymore, and nobody misses them, you know. But I think a place where you kind of see the discussion is Henry's Tacos. You know, there was a taco stand over on Tujunga and Riverside, not very good, and but a lot of people loved it. They went there a long time. They hadn't been going there through the years, or because it wasn't that successful. But as soon as it was talked about being closed down, people came out to just, you know, let's try to save Henry's Tacos. And I think the expression that happened there was good enough, frankly, for me.
Yeah.
Everybody got to talk about Henry's Tacos, and, you know, but it's not designated as historic, because once they took the sign off, nobody thought it was special at all anymore. So
We're going to
I'm
have
sure there
to.
are people who disagree, by the way.
We're going to have to wrap up now. I'm sorry. We'll be around so you can come up and ask questions. But I wanted to thank Bob and Don and Kevin for a great presentation. And the LA Conservancy and the Getty as well.
Thank you all very much. Please go buy books, have more conversation with our authors. We'll see you out in the neighborhoods this afternoon or at Landmark This. Thank you so much, and thank you to Elena for being here.
Thank you.